Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Miss Gnant's version of Undisclosed. This is episode 4, 28 Days. Heyman Lee disappeared on January 13th, 1999, and her body was found on February 9th, 28 days later. This episode of the podcast goes through the chronology of all of the days in between. But they're going to skip the days for which they have no documentation, and that's good because we don't want information that we can't substantiate. So let's start with Wednesday, January 13th, 1999. We've been over this and over this and over this a bunch of times. We've done Hay's Day and Jay's Day and Adnan's Day. So the basics are that Hay left school soon after 2:20 p.m. after telling Becky she had somewhere else to be. She was supposed to pick up her cousin at about 3:15, but she never showed up. The school called Hay's brother at about 3:30 to let them know that the cousin was still there and needed to be picked up. At 5:12 p.m., her family contacted the police, and Officer Adcock got to their home at about 5:30 p.m. Now that's interesting because that's a really fast response for an 18-year-old missing person. Usually much longer would go by before the police would even start to investigate that. One idea that people have is because of this girl named Jada Lambert. Jada Lambert was another Woodlawn student, and she had gone missing about 6 months before Hay, and they found her that she was dead and she had been strangled. Fast forward to now we know that it was Roy Davis, this guy named Roy Davis, who had done it, and he is one of the people who the Innocence Project is trying to have tested against the DNA from Adnan's crime scene, if they can make it as far as testing the DNA from Adnan's crime scene. Now, there is some evidence in the file that the police did consider a link between Jada Lambert's case and Hay's, so that does help make some sense out of that fast reaction. So on this same day, Adcock called both Adnan and Aisha, and remember Aisha was Hay's best friend. He also called the lens crafters at Owings Mills to find out if Hay had shown up for work, but no, she hadn't. There's no mention of a wrestling match in his report, so it seems like both her family and the police believe that Hay's only plans for the day were to get her cousin and then go to work. Officer Adcock did attempt to contact Don, but he couldn't get a hold of Don at that time. Now, Adcock does talk to Don at 1:30 in the morning. They have a brief conversation, and Don says he actually hadn't seen Hay that day. Don says he was working at the other lens crafters at Hunt Valley that day, and he was covering for somebody else. He says he got off at 6, he was home by 7, and he got a call from the Owings Mills location asking if he knew where Hay was because she hadn't shown up to work. No one really knows why he didn't connect with Adcock until 1:30 in the morning, but when he does, he says he hasn't seen her, he hasn't contacted her, he hasn't heard from her, he doesn't know anything about where she might be. Please forgive the scratching noise in the background. For some reason, my dog feels the need to be scratching on the carpet right next to me while I do this. So at 3 or 4 a.m., an ice storm rolls in. Travel is really, really dangerous, so the school's shut down. At some point, the Baltimore County Police contact Hay's family, and they report, nope, they still haven't heard from Hay. They don't know where she is. Now, another just random side note, remember that this is the day that at trial, Jen says she went to work, and then after she got off work, she went to get Jay, and this was when she helped him dispose of his clothes in a dumpster. She says she remembers that day because it was raining. Now, that's weird. It was a huge winter storm with snow and ice. Photos show that there was snow and ice everywhere. So how do you remember rain when it was actually snow and ice all over the place? At any rate, that was one of the last nights of Ramadan, and 3 different witnesses say that Adnan gave a talk at the mosque and helped lead prayers. One of those witnesses was a guy named Bilal, and Bilal remembers going over notes with Adnan the night before, on the 13th. Of course, that's important because if Adnan was at the mosque going over notes with Bilal on the 13th, he was not high at Kathy's after having buried a body with Jay. And although he's a biased witness, Adnan's father does also remember Adnan having given a talk and leading prayers that day, because it was a really proud moment for him. Friday, January 15th, travel is still not safe, so school is canceled again. Krista, who was friends with both Hay and Adnan, had a birthday party. She distinctly remembers Adnan coming at about 8:30 and that he arrived with Jay and Stephanie and that they had all ridden together in the same car. The reason this is interesting is because Jay testified at trial that he'd only seen Adnan a couple of times since the 13th. He says that one of those times would have been the 15th, but Jay says he saw Adnan that day because Adnan dropped Stephanie off after school. But there was no school that day. Now, Jay also makes no mention of going to a party that day. But call records show that a couple of calls are actually made from Adnan's phone to Jay around 6 and 7 p.m. that night. So it seems like that's them coordinating going to the party that they were seen at. But why is that significant? Well, that's because Jay's story is that he's scared of Adnan. If they buried a body together 2 days ago and Adnan has left him alone for the last 2 days and he's so terrified of Adnan, why are they suddenly coordinating to go to a party together and then riding and arriving at this party together and hanging out? All right, so now we skip ahead to Tuesday, January 19th. This was the first day back to school after the snow days. That was Thursday and Friday, and MLK Day was that Monday, so that was off. So at this point, people do notice that Hay is not back, but nobody thinks it's really a big deal. They assume she's just off with her boyfriend. Wednesday, January 20th is the first day that Adnan's back because the Tuesday, the day before, was a religious holiday. Now, it's been a week since Hay went missing, but still nobody's really too worried about her absence. It's final exam time. The kids only have half days of school. They're all out of their routine, so it's less likely people are really noticing that Hay is not there. Friday, January 22nd, there's no school because it's the day off between semesters. It's kind of like our grading day. Now, if you're paying attention, there's only been one full day of school since Hay disappeared. By this time, Detective O'Shea has taken over the case. He talks to Don on this day, probably over the phone, but we're not sure because the notes are not specific. Don says that he last saw Hay on the 12th. She was happy, in a good mood about the relationship, but that she was fighting with her mom over things like phone privileges and breaking curfew. But he had no indication from her that she was planning to run away from home. This is also the day that the podcasters discussed in one of the addendums where they think this is the day that Jay and Adnan actually went to Christy's house. Remember, Christy is not her real name, Kathy, but then it came out that her name is Christy. So they think that this is the day that Adnan and Jay went to hang out at Christy's house. And they link it to this workshop that she went to. If you want to know more details about how they do that and the details of that, that's in either Addendum 1 or Addendum 2. But at any rate, they think this is actually the day, so a week and a half later after Hay has gone missing, this is the day that they think that Adnan was there, high, acting weird, got a phone call. So this means it's possible that in addition to calling Don, O'Shea tried to talk to Adnan as well. And that would make sense because if O'Shea just came onto the case, he's going to want to get up to speed with both Adnan and Don at the same time. So Saturday, January 23rd, there's this guy named Yasser who was friends with Adnan and also knew Jay and Stephanie through a common friend. Yasser is significant because he remembers being at a party on January 23rd. And guess who was at that party with him? Adnan and Jay and Stephanie were all there and they all came together. That means this is the second party where Jay, who is allegedly terrified of Adnan, is arriving with and hanging out with Adnan. Monday, January 25th, Detective O'Shea goes to Adnan's house and talks to his mom while Adnan's at school. O'Shea leaves his card. Adnan calls him back later that afternoon. According to the report that O'Shea wrote, Adnan says that on January 13th, he was in class with Hay until 2:15. He didn't see Hay after school, and he went to track practice. Now, what's interesting about this is this intricacy, this tiny little detail in the arguments between the state and Adnan's attorney for his current appeal. Now, Adnan's attorneys are arguing ineffective assistance of counsel. They're saying Gutierrez never contacted Asia McClain as an alibi witness and that she should have. The state says Adnan is a liar because they say that he said he never left the school campus. So if he was at the library, he lied to the detectives because that's off campus. And so then Asia McClain is just proof that he's a big fat liar. Now, keep in mind that most people consider the library to be a part of the school campus. But even if you want to be a stickler for details and you look at O'Shea's notes, Adnan never says that he stayed on campus. But that's a tiny little detail, but this entire appeal could be hanging on that. Now, another interesting thing about this interview is that O'Shea never asks Adnan about whether or not he asked Hay for a ride. The 25th was also the first day of the new semester. The teachers noticed she wasn't there, but nobody was really too concerned. She had high enough grades, she could miss without having too much of an effect on her grade. They do also note that the students don't really seem very worried. And it was actually not until about 3 weeks after Hay disappeared that there was even a faculty meeting called to discuss it. Now, I promise you guys, if any of you goes disappearing, it will be less than 3 weeks before I make sure somebody is looking into it. Wednesday, January 27th, this is the first day that the police interview anybody other than Adnan or Don. That person who they interview is Aisha, Hayes' best friend. Aisha is interviewed by Detective O'Shea. Now, fun fact, this is Wednesday, January 27th. The notes from this interview are dated February 14th. These notes are also incredibly brief. They say two things. They say that Hay had told Aisha she was having problems with her mom, but that it wasn't significant enough to leave. And although Hay had talked about California, she never talked about going there. The other thing in the notes is that Aisha was in class with Hay on January 13th, saw her at the end of class at 2:15 p.m. Hay was in good spirits and didn't mention any problems at the time. So one question is, what did Aisha tell O'Shea that didn't make it into the notes? Specifically, Krista says that Aisha told her that day that Hay had told her that something came up in psychology. So which was it? Nothing was wrong or something had come up? Now here's where Colin points out that almost all of the notes from the Baltimore County Police are dated February 14th. This is after Hayes' body was found and after Adnan was identified as a suspect. Colin says it seems like the notes were written purposely briefly and vaguely and without detail. Yep, Hay was happy. Yep, she wasn't running away. Nothing to see here. Don't look too closely. Now, it definitely seems like Aisha would say more than these two things. If your best friend had been missing for 2 weeks and you were talking to the police, wouldn't you basically do a brain dump of everything you could possibly remember? It wouldn't be just two things. Whatever. So Thursday, January 28th, O'Shea talks to Debbie. Debbie says she last saw Hay at 3 p.m. on the 13th. From that point on, all of the news articles are going to report this as fact. It just sort of becomes common knowledge that Hay was last seen at 3 p.m. That might be why Adnan didn't think it was significant that he saw Asia McClain before 3 p.m. in the library. As far as everyone is concerned, as of 3 p.m., Hay is still alive and kicking. So seeing Asia before 3 p.m. is completely irrelevant. Now, at this point in the podcast, which is about the 20-minute mark, they talk about this plan Debbie came up with involving a fake email account and contacting Don and having phone conversations with him. It's all really complicated. Listen to it if you want to. But this is when the kids at school become convinced that Hay is actually not with Don. Monday, February 1st. This is when O'Shea talks to Hope Schaub, the French teacher. According to O'Shea's notes, not much is said. According to Schaub, O'Shea gives her a list of questions to ask the students and asks her to be the go-between for the police in the Woodlawn community. She actually testified that she was given questions to ask. Questions like, do you know where Hay and Adnan used to hook up? Take a minute and think about that. Think about one of your teachers asking you that question about a missing friend and another kid at school. That's gross. So this is the day O'Shea also talks to Inez Butler. She tells him that Hay was not going to go to a wrestling match that day and that Hay told her on the 13th that she was having problems at home and she wanted to contact her father in California. O'Shea also talks to the manager at the Owings Mills Lens Crafters. Please note, the police never contact anyone at the Hunt Valley store, which is where Don says that he was working on the day Hay disappeared. The manager at Owings Mills tells O'Shea that Don was working at Hunt Valley that day, the 13th. But we don't actually know what the source of her information is. Like, did she look at time clock records or sign-ins or something? And in fact, Don was actually working at the Owings Mills store at the time that O'Shea called the Owings Mills store and talked to the manager. So it's actually entirely possible that she turned around, she looked at Don and said, hey, weren't you working at the Hunt Valley store that day? And he said, yeah, I was. And she turned around and she was like, yeah, he was working at the Hunt Valley store that day. So who knows? And this is the only time during the investigation that the police try to verify Don's story. They don't attempt to get any kind of records or documentation to verify what they've been told. This is also the date of Adnan's second interview. O'Shea calls Adnan and they talk. This time, O'Shea asks him about Officer Adcock's report. Now remember, Officer Adcock was the officer who made the initial missing persons report and called Aisha and Adnan on the evening of the 13th. So in this interview, O'Shea reads something from the report, quoting Adnan saying he was supposed to get a ride home from Hay after school. In this phone call, Adnan corrects O'Shea and says, nope, I didn't say that. Later, at trial, this is used as evidence that Adnan was lying. But if O'Shea thought something was up with Adnan getting a ride or not getting a ride, why did he wait until February 1st to ask about it? Now, these notes were also written on the 14th, in hindsight, after Adnan has been arrested. Colin points out that even Officer Adcock's report seems a little odd. It's 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph is really brief and factual. But the handwriting in the second and third paragraph seems a lot less hurried. Still Adcock's handwriting, but it definitely looks like it was written at a different time. Colin points out it's possible that the report was added to at a later date. And you know what would have prevented that? A line through unused space, just like Gnant is always trying to get you to do on your reports. Tuesday, February 2nd, Hayes' mother's ex-boyfriend, who it turns out was never actually married to Hayes' mother, the guy who lives in California, was contacted by Detective O'Shea. This dude says he hasn't heard from or seen Hayes since January 13th. Well, how did they get in contact with him? Debbie says that either she or Aisha, she doesn't remember which, told the police that Hay had family in California and they thought she might have gone there. Now, Don had also suggested that there was this possibility that there was family in California, so it turns out this is actually one lead that the police did manage to follow up on. Wednesday, February 3rd. For perspective, this is 3 weeks since Hayes' disappearance. There's only one record in the police file from February 3rd, and it's a printout from the online database that pulls records on people, like criminal records. So they pulled this one record. Guess whose record they pulled on February 3rd? Yep, Adnan's. There are no other notes or anything explaining why they pulled it or what they were going to do with the records. They just did. And he's the only person in the entire investigation whose records they pulled. This is significant because it indicates that as of this point, he's being identified as a suspect. Now keep in mind, this is before the anonymous call saying look into the ex-boyfriend. This is before his cell phone records are pulled, before they've talked to Jay, before they've talked to Jen. And this is in the context of the last person Hay saw heard her say, I'm going to see Don. Why wouldn't they also at least pull Don's records? Thursday, February 4th, the Baltimore Sun publishes a request for information on a missing woman, Heyman Lee. This piece gives more evidence that public information was out there, that Hay was last seen at 3 p.m. It also makes no mention of a wrestling match. So again, we can be pretty sure that wrestling match thing was just kind of a red herring. Now, the 4th is also the first time there's a video clip about Hay being missing. And there's this crazy way that Jen talks about seeing this video clip. And she describes being at this bar near Jay's house and kind of what her reaction was. And it's weird and kind of strange because she talks about how surprised she was that she saw it on the news. But why would she be surprised? Because she allegedly helped Jay get rid of evidence from having buried the body. But then she's talking about it as though it's Hay's body, even though the clip is talking about Hay as a missing person. And it's just weird. If you want to listen to that section, go to about the 31-minute mark. But at any rate, whatever she knew, this video clip inspired Jen to go to her friend Nicole and say, hey, I know that girl on TV and I know who killed her. So here's another weird thing to stick onto your mountain of weird things. It's in the notes from Jen's first interview on February 26th that she says that Nicole told her that Hay had died by strangulation. Now, that information had not been released to the public yet. Now, the police figured this was significant, because if somebody knows something that's not public yet, they must have some tie to the killer. And even if Nicole isn't the source of the strangulation information, she at least knew about the murder 4 days before the body was found because Jen told her. But guess what? At no point ever did the police go talk to Nicole. Saturday, February 6th, the police take dogs out to search the woods and the fields around the high school. Now, this is the point where there's a map showing that the police were linking Hayes' disappearance to Jada Lambert's disappearance. At that point, Jada's case was still open and they didn't know about Roy Davis yet. Monday, February 8th, this is the day that Detective O'Shea gets Hayes' computer to search for evidence. On the same day, Detective Rao from the Computer Crimes Unit subpoenas records from AOL, America Online, in reference to Hayes' email accounts. But a week later, Detective Rao lets Detective McGillivray and Detective Carew know that he was told to stop investigating things related to the computer because the case had gone from missing persons to homicide and it had been transferred from Baltimore County to Baltimore City. From that point forward, the computer is gone. The records are gone. Nobody knows where that information is. That's especially frustrating because Hay apparently spent a lot of time online in chat rooms and communicating with friends online on a regular basis. And this is where Colin shares his personal theory. He thinks that somebody paged Hay between lunch and AP Psych. And if we had chat rooms and emails and other stuff from her computer, we might be able to figure out who contacted her and got her to change her plans for after school. So then they go into some stuff about Hay's AOL profile, and there's some pretty smarmy stuff about how much she loves Don. And there's some indication that she was more into Don than he was into her, and that the police knew that. If you want to listen to that, that starts at about the 39:30 mark. Here's another shady thing. We know that at 3:55 p.m., Adnan made a phone call to Detective O'Shea and that he did it on his cell phone. But O'Shea's records don't say anything about that conversation. He acknowledges at trial that he had additional conversations with Adnan, but we have no idea what the content of that conversation was. So, February 9th, police get the call from Mr. S saying he's found a body. They go to the college where he worked, they drive to the park together, he shows them the body. Homicide is called, the scene is secured, and Mr. S is taken to the station for questioning a couple hours later. Now here, Rabia and Sarah talk a bit about what the scene looks like. They talk about how hard it was to find the right location. They actually went looking once and they found the wrong location, thinking it was the right location. And then they went back a second time and found the right location. And how weird the real actual location really is. And the likelihood of anybody choosing that place to go to the bathroom in the woods is a really, really, really slim possibility. So then they go into some speculation about what Mr. S might have really been doing there. And it's entirely possible he was out there streaking, because who knows what the habits of a streaker are. But maybe he was there a different day and he saw something, and on this day he went back to investigate what he had seen. Or maybe he had heard something around town. He heard a rumor, and then he went back specifically looking for the body. Then they circle back around to Jen and Nicole. And there's this weird conversation between Jen and Nicole about how Nicole's mom actually found a body that day. But there are details that just don't make any sense at all. If you want to listen to that part, it's at about the 48-minute mark. But again, here you have Nicole being mentioned as having information, but not being questioned by the police. She actually even made it onto a list of people to be interviewed, but they never followed through and interviewed her. So back to the body. 2 people from the medical examiner's office recovered the body, but we don't have a lot of information about that process because, at the state's request, the medical examiners did not take written notes at the scene. There's only one reason that they would not take written notes at the scene, and that's because of our good old discovery rule. Remember, discovery says that prosecution has to turn over written reports to the defense. If there are no written reports, there's nothing to turn over. So what do we have from the medical examiner? What we have is a 1-page summary that was actually made by the prosecutor, Kathleen Murphy. The entirety of the report of the crime scene and the disinterment says this: body partially buried, very little of body exposed, could not see from street. They found trace evidence, 2 pieces, bright orange fiber towards shoulder area, and another fiber that was fluorescent blue. The orange fiber was synthetic and on top of the body. The other was underneath. Fiber does not belong to victim's clothing. Rocks piled on her, area had been dug out, dirt over it. Large rocks on body, 1 on hand. Keep animals from dragging body off. Way body is exposed, animal activity. Soil samples typical of wooded area, highly organic. Collected plants, green plant material. Couldn't tell if tool used. Now, that might explain Jen's confusion about the tools, because she didn't know if what they disposed of were shovels or picks or a shovel and a pick, and it's actually possible there were no tools used at all. So they also found a bunch of stuff along the roadside: 2 Blockbuster video cases, a rolled condom, a condom wrapper, an assortment of cartridge casings. Other than these things, only 3 other things were taken into evidence, and those 3 other things were all taken from near Hay's body. Now, this is significant because at trial, Urich tries to make it seem like the crime scene was really messy and full of litter. But it turns out that all of the litter was actually way back at the roadside, and that's far away from that spot, isolated far back in the woods near the body. So what things did they collect from near the body? Well, the first thing they collected was a feather, or feathers. We're not really clear because they use both the singular and the plural. But the feather or the feathers were found about 2 feet from Hayes' body on a log. But this is the woods. Wouldn't you expect a feather to be there? Why would you collect a feather out in the woods? Well, Susan suggests that it's either because they were collecting literally everything in the area, or it's because it wasn't a wild bird feather that you would expect to be there. Like maybe it was a feather from a down jacket or a down blanket or something. But of course, we don't have pictures, we don't have descriptions, and we don't have the feather. So we don't know anything about these feathers or if they really mattered or not. Another item found not at the roadside was the rope. The rope was found 5 inches from Hayes' body. Most of the reports call it a rope, but one of the initial reports calls it a section of clothesline. And in another early report, it's described as a section of insulated wire. After that, it's just referred to as a rope. Now, I don't know about you, but there's a big difference between a clothesline and a rope in my mind. And there's a big difference between an insulated wire and a rope in my mind. But we can't see it because when Gutierrez went back and conducted an evidence review, they couldn't locate the rope. Now, it's crazy that this wasn't tested because the medical examiners say that it's possible that Hay was manually strangled, like by somebody wearing gloves, but it's also possible that she was strangled with something like a rope. So if they had a rope, they could determine if it was literally the murder weapon. Now, the third item found near the body was a brandy bottle. This was 8 inches from where Hay was buried. They did test this, and they retrieved human skin cells from the neck of the bottle. That means there was DNA that could be tested, but they never requested testing of it. Why could that be? Well, Susan says she thinks she knows. The cops went and asked Adnan's friends if he drank, but they pretty much all said no. If they saw him drink, it was once or twice, not the kind of thing where you'd be chugging down a bottle of brandy right before you bury a body. So if the police thought that that brandy bottle was going to give evidence that pointed away from Adnan, they didn't want that evidence. And there are actually articles that were published not long after Hayes' death that talk about how this was kind of a policy that the Baltimore police had at the time. Don't test DNA evidence if you think it's going to complicate your investigation. Now, in case you think that maybe the DNA wasn't tested for budgetary reasons, that is not the case because they did perform DNA testing on one item. It was on a shirt that was found in Hayes' car, a shirt that had some blood stains on it. They didn't test it till September or October, and they determined that the bloodstains were probably Hayes' blood. But here's the kicker about that. When the analyst got the exemplar samples for Jay and Adnan and Hay, the vial for Jay was sealed. The seals on the vials of Adnan's blood and Hayes' blood were broken. Now stop, don't jump to conspiracy theories. Nobody thinks Adnan's blood was planted anywhere. No blood was found anywhere. But what might have happened is that there may have been previous DNA testing that got done and wasn't disclosed because the state didn't like the results. But the point is, chain of custody was broken, and so now we have even more questions about the credibility of the state's case. And even though they're doing DNA testing on that shirt 9 months later, they don't feel the need to test DNA on a brandy bottle that was found inches from the body. Something's fishy about that decision. So where are we now? The Baltimore City Police have an open homicide investigation. Evidence has been collected from the crime scene, and Hayes' body has been taken to the medical examiner's office to have an autopsy performed. The police are still searching for her car, which will eventually become a second crime scene and inform the state's narrative. Remember, that narrative says that Hay was killed in her car by 2:36 p.m. Her body was hidden in the trunk of her own car, and she was buried around 7 p.m. that night. The state corroborates this story using the Lincoln Park pings. But does the autopsy report corroborate that? You'll have to wait till our next episode.